My parents kicked my daughter out in the middle of the night. Now they're begging me for help, and then I never thought I'd find myself standing in front of this house again, staring at the same faded blue door that had once slammed shut behind me when I walked away all those years ago. My fingers hovered over the doorbell, my heart hammering in my chest despite the calm mask I wore. The phone in my pocket still felt warm from my mother's unexpected call, her voice urgent yet strangely fragile, asking me to come over. I almost hadn't come, but here I was, against my better judgment, with my car still idling in the driveway, as if a part of me wasn't ready to commit to this moment. Behind me, my 13-year-old daughter, Sophie, wasn't here for this reunion. I had dropped her off at my best friend, Rachel's, house just before driving over. It won't take long, I had told her, though I had no idea if that was true. The last time I stood in this spot was at my grandmother's funeral 3 years ago. Before that, it was the day I turned 18, the day my parents, Margaret and Howard, made it clear who really mattered in this family. The day they took my college fund, the one my grandmother had set aside for me, and handed it to my younger sister, Vanessa, for her wedding. "Your sister needs a proper wedding," my mother had said when I protested, my voice shaking with disbelief. "You can take out student loans like everyone else." I still remembered how cold the air felt against my tear-streaked face when I walked away that night, knowing I was no longer welcome in my own home. The only person who had stood by me was my grandmother. She was the one who helped me scrape together enough money for community college, not the prestigious university I had worked for, but something. I had worked hard, built a life for myself, and never once asked my parents for anything. They hadn't even come to my wedding, and when I got divorced 2 years ago, they barely acknowledged it. It didn't matter. I had Sophie, I had my independence, and I had an apartment I owned, thanks to the inheritance my grandmother had left me. Between that rental income, the alimony from my ex-husband, and my job as a financial consultant, I had built a stable life, one where I didn't have to rely on anyone. So why, after all these years, did they suddenly need me? I exhaled sharply and pressed the doorbell. It didn't take long. The door swung open, and there stood my mother, Margaret, looking smaller than I remembered. More gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. "Clara, you came," she said, her voice thick with something that almost sounded like relief. My father stood behind her, his expression stiff and unreadable, his attempt at a smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Where's Sophie?" my mother asked, craning her neck as if expecting my daughter to materialize behind me. "She's at a friend's," I said, stepping inside before she could press further. "You said this was urgent?" The house smelled the same, a mix of my mother's ever-present vanilla air freshener and my father's bitter coffee. But it looked different. The furniture, once pristine and expensive, was now worn down, frayed at the edges, much like the people who lived here. They led me to the living room, where my mother fidgeted with the hem of her sweater before offering. "Would you like some tea?" "Just tell me why you called," I said, staying on my feet. For a moment, there was only silence. Then my mother broke down, not the quiet, dignified tears I remembered from childhood, but full-body, shaking sobs. My father placed a hesitant arm around her before finally speaking. "We're going to lose the house." I didn't react, just waited, because I knew there had to be more. There was always more with them. "Your sister," my mother began, and my stomach clenched. Of course, it was always about Vanessa. She hesitated, glancing at my father, who took over. "She asked us to take out a business loan for Derek's company. We put the house up as collateral." I felt something inside me snap into place, a horrible understanding settling in. "And let me guess," I said, my voice flat. "Vanessa and Derek aren't paying." My father looked away. "The business failed. They stopped making payments months ago. We tried to cover it, but you can't." I finished for him, my arms folding tightly across my chest. "We didn't know who else to ask," my mother pleaded, wiping at her face. "We know you're doing well, Clara. You have that apartment, the rental income, your job. We wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate." I laughed then, a sharp, humorless sound that made them both flinch. "So, let me get this straight. You called the daughter you abandoned, the one whose future you threw away, because now you need money?" "Clara, please," my mother whispered. "We're family." I stared at them. These people who had turned their backs on me so many times, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a hollow sort of detachment. Still, I surprised even myself when I said, "I'll think about it." I turned and walked out before they could say another word. On the drive back, my mind raced in circles. I didn't know them anything. I had built my life without them. But then I thought of Sophie, how her eyes had lit up when I mentioned I had seen my parents, how she had asked if she could meet them. The thought stayed with me for days, lingering in the back of my mind as I tossed and turned at night, imagining every possible scenario. "You're insane," Rachel said over coffee a week later when I told her I was considering helping them. "After everything they did." "Maybe I am," I admitted, stirring my drink aimlessly. "But Sophie deserves a chance to know them. And maybe I need this too." And so, a week after I had sworn to never go back, I found myself pulling into my parents' driveway again. Only this time, Sophie was in the passenger seat, practically vibrating with excitement. The moment my mother opened the door, she burst into tears again, and my father just stood there awkwardly before Sophie ran up to hug them both. They looked stunned, then something softened in their expressions. Genuine joy flickered in their eyes, the kind I used to see when they looked at Vanessa. We spent the afternoon together, and I watched as Sophie charmed them effortlessly, telling stories about school, her friends, the time she won the spelling bee. They listened to every word, and for the first time, I saw something unexpected in my mother's eyes. Regret. That night, as Sophie chattered happily on the drive home about how much she liked her grandparents, I made my decision. Maybe I was making a mistake. Maybe I was setting myself up for more hurt. But I was going to help them. The decision settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake, but I convinced myself I was doing the right thing, for Sophie, if nothing else. A week later, I called my real estate agent and arranged to rent out my apartment again. I could use the rental income to help with the loan payments. That same night, I called my mother. Before I could second-guess myself, I said, "I'll help with the loan." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped, but then my mother started crying. "Thank you, Clara. Thank you so much. I wasn't doing this for them, and I needed her to know that. Sophie and I are moving in," I said before she could get too comfortable with the idea of me just sending money. "The rent from my apartment will go toward the loan, but I'm setting boundaries. I'm not here to be taken advantage of." 2 weeks later, Sophie and I arrived with boxes packed neatly in the trunk of my car, moving into the house I once swore I'd never step foot in again. It felt surreal, watching my father struggle to hide his discomfort while my mother fussed over Sophie as if she had been a doting grandmother all along. The house itself was still the same, but I immediately set about changing the things I could. I replaced the old refrigerator with one that actually worked, bought a dishwasher that wouldn't break down mid-cycle, and got a washing machine that didn't sound like it was preparing for liftoff. Sophie was delighted, especially with the new fridge that had an ice maker she used far more than necessary. My father's back problems, which he had spent years grumbling about, improved now that he didn't have to wash dishes by hand. My mother, always claiming to be overwhelmed, suddenly had no complaints when I took charge of the household expenses. At first, things settled into an easy rhythm. My mother started making breakfast every morning, something she had never done when I was a child, and for a while, I let myself believe we were healing. She picked Sophie up from school, helped with homework, and even started baking with her, something I had never had the patience for. My father cut back on work and spent more time at home, introducing Sophie to chess, a game I never learned, and their weekly matches quickly became a routine. I started taking on more hours at work, knowing Sophie was being looked after. Then, one afternoon, I was called into my boss's office. "We've noticed your increased dedication," he said, and then he offered me a promotion. It came with a raise, but also the expectation of traveling for business. A year ago, I would have turned it down without hesitation. Single mom, no real support system, it wouldn't have worked. But now things were different. "I'll take it," I said, surprising even myself. The first time I had to leave for a business trip, I was a nervous wreck. 3 days in Denver felt like an eternity, but my mother sent me pictures of Sophie doing homework, eating dinner, laughing with my father. It worked. It all worked. For the first time in my life, it felt like I was part of a functioning family. But then I started noticing little things. My mother would take phone calls behind closed doors, emerging with red-rimmed eyes. I would catch glimpses of bank transfers on her phone, money leaving her account, and when I finally asked, her answer made my stomach turn. Lisa needs help sometimes, she said with a tired sigh, as if I was the unreasonable one. She's going through a rough patch with Derek. I almost laughed. A rough patch? I repeated. Mom, I'm paying for all of your bills and the loan that Lisa defaulted on. How is it fair that you're sending her money? You don't understand? My mother snapped, suddenly defensive. Lisa isn't to blame for Derek's business failing. She has 2 children to think about. And I have one, I said coldly. And all your bills to pay. My mother turned away, shutting down the conversation the way she always did when it came to Lisa. The arguments became more frequent after that. I told myself I could ignore it, that it wasn't worth ruining everything when Sophie was happy, but deep down, I knew. I knew this family had never changed. My father, who had stayed out of the fights for the most part, finally spoke one night after a few glasses of wine. We made mistakes, he said, staring at the table. Big ones. I wanted to say more, to finally have the conversation we had avoided for nearly 20 years, but my mother quickly changed the subject to Sophie's upcoming school play, as if an apology would shatter the carefully rebuilt illusion she had been crafting. I let it go. I had bigger things to worry about. 3 years passed like this. Sophie turned 13, looking more grown up every day. I got used to my new role at work, traveling every few weeks, but always coming home to a happy daughter. The loan payments were steady, the bills were paid, and life was stable. But then came that Tuesday. I remember it was Tuesday because I had just closed a huge deal in Miami and caught an early flight home to surprise Sophie. As I pulled into the driveway, I heard voices from inside. Too many voices. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. I opened the front door and stepped into chaos. There, sprawled on my mother's couch, the same one I had just paid to have reupholstered, was Vanessa. Her 2 kids, Noah and Olivia, were on the floor with their tablets, suitcases scattered around the room. Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. Oh, she said, her voice lazy. Look who's here. I didn't move, my work bag still hanging from my shoulder, my exhaustion evaporating as I took in the scene. We left Derek, Vanessa announced, stretching as if she had just come back from a vacation rather than leaving her marriage. Total deadbeat. So, we'll be staying here for a while. The words hit like a slap. You'll be staying here? I repeated, my voice slow, deliberate. In the house where I pay all the bills. The loan that you defaulted on. Vanessa's expression darkened. Oh, here we go, she snapped, waving a hand dismissively. Miss Perfect with her money and her job. Some of us have real problems, Clara. Actual problems. I felt the sharp sting of betrayal, the bitter taste of history repeating itself. I turned to my parents, hoping, praying, that they would back me up. They didn't. My father looked at the floor. My mother bit her lip and said softly, She has nowhere else to go, Clara. We need to support each other. I laughed, but it came out hollow. Funny how family only matters when you need something. My mother bristled. That was years ago. Why can't you let it go? I stared at her, at my father, at Vanessa lounging on the couch like she had never left. You want to talk about letting things go? I said, voice low. Fine. I'm letting this go right now. But don't think for a second I'm letting it happen again. Vanessa rolled her eyes and went back to her phone. My mother sighed. My father said nothing. And I knew, in that moment, that I had made a terrible mistake. Vanessa settled into the house as if she had never left, slipping effortlessly back into the role of the favored daughter while I watched from the sidelines, furious but not surprised. She didn't get a job, didn't even pretend to look for one. Instead, she spent her days sprawled on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while her kids ran wild through the house, making messes that were somehow never hers to clean. My mother doted on them, fussing over Noah's schoolwork, helping Olivia with her hair every morning, cooking meals tailored to their preferences while Sophie and I became an afterthought. The shift was gradual at first, almost imperceptible, until one day I realized that my parents no longer paid attention to Sophie at all. She noticed it before I did. The first time, she had come home from school, excited to show my mother a math test she had aced. Grandma, look, I got a 98, she said, beaming, waving the paper in front of her. My mother barely glanced up from where she was kneeling beside Noah, helping him with a puzzle. That's nice, sweetheart, she said absent-mindedly before turning her attention back to him. Sophie stood there, the paper still in her hand, her smile slipping. Then, a week later, she asked my father if they could play chess, one of their traditions, something they had done every Sunday since we moved in. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. I'm tired, Sophie, not tonight. An hour later, I found him in the backyard playing catch with Noah, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in years. Sophie stood in the kitchen, watching through the window, her shoulders slumped. I started taking on more projects at work, throwing myself into my career, because being at home had become unbearable. I knew it was only a matter of time before my mother would try to guilt me into giving Vanessa money, and I wasn't ready for that fight yet. Instead, I worked late, making excuses to stay out longer because the house wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to Vanessa and her children, and we were just guests, an afterthought, a means to an end. One Wednesday afternoon, I got home earlier than usual, deciding that Sophie and I needed an escape. Ice cream, a movie, anything to make up for the way she had been ignored lately. As I opened the front door, I heard shouting, "You lazy, good-for-nothing brat." Vanessa's voice rang through the house, sharp and venomous. "Look at this mess. Clean it up right now." I rushed inside to find Vanessa standing over Sophie, who was on her knees, hurriedly picking up scattered toys, Noah and Olivia's toys. Vanessa's face was twisted in anger, arms crossed, while my mother stood in the kitchen pretending not to hear. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. Vanessa scoffed. "Your precious princess refuses to help around the house," she said. "She thinks she's too good to clean up after her cousins." I looked down at Sophie, her small hands clutching a handful of toy cars, her face red with embarrassment. I turned back to Vanessa. "You mean your kids' mess?" I said coldly. "Where are they?" Vanessa shrugged. "They're napping. Someone has to keep this house in order, and since you're never here." "I'm never here because I'm working," I snapped, stepping between her and Sophie. Unlike some people who lie around all day expecting everyone else to support them. The fight that followed was ugly. Vanessa shrieked about how I had always been selfish, how I had always acted like I was better than her, how I had never understood what it was like to have responsibilities. My mother rushed to her defense, of course, saying I was being too harsh, that Vanessa was going through a hard time. "Lisa's children need us," my father added weakly. "And what about my child?" I shot back. "Does she not count?" Nobody answered. They never did when it came to choosing between Vanessa and me. That night, I locked myself in my room with Sophie and made a plan. I would give it one more month. 1 month to figure out where we would go, to make arrangements, to find a way to leave without completely disrupting Sophie's life. I refused to let history repeat itself, and I refused to let my daughter feel like she didn't matter. But I had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The following week, I was called away for an emergency business trip in Seattle, just 5 days. "You'll be okay?" I asked Sophie at breakfast for the 100th time. "I'll be fine, Mom," she said with a small smile. "We can video chat every night." The fourth night, my phone rang at 9 p.m. Seattle time. Sophie's picture flashed on the screen. I answered immediately, my stomach twisting. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm outside." My breath caught. "What? What do you mean you're outside?" "Aunt Lisa kicked me out," she said, sniffling. "She said I was in the way. I only have my phone." I didn't know what to do. The world stopped spinning. My 13-year-old daughter was outside, at night, alone, and my parents had let it happen. Shaking, I called Rachel. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "Sophie's outside my parents' house. Go get her." Then I called Vanessa. She answered on the 5th ring, sounding annoyed. "Oh, did the little princess call you?" she sneered. "Maybe now she'll learn not to be so stubborn. Always arguing, always thinking she's better than everyone else." I hung up and called my mother. She answered, her voice cautious. "Sophie is outside," I said, my voice cold. "Did you know that? Did you watch Lisa throw her out?" There was a pause, then my mother sighed. "Maybe it's better this way, Clara. Maybe you and Sophie should find somewhere else to live. You don't really fit here anymore." A numbness spread through me. "You're right, Mom," I said quietly. "We don't fit here. We never did." I booked the first flight home. It was time to end this cycle once and for all. The flight home was the longest 5 hours of my life. Rachel sent me updates every half hour, but I couldn't breathe properly until I saw Sophie with my own eyes. When I finally arrived at Rachel's house at 3 in the morning, she was asleep on the couch, curled up in a ball, dried tear tracks still visible on her cheeks. I knelt beside her, brushing the hair from her face, my rage boiling beneath my skin. Rachel sat beside me, lowering her voice. She told me what happened, she whispered. Clara, it's worse than you think. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the blanket draped over Sophie. Tell me. Rachel hesitated, then sighed. Lisa's been treating her like a servant for weeks, making her clean up after her kids, cook meals, do their laundry. A cold horror crept up my spine. Why didn't she tell me? Rachel glanced at Sophie and shook her head. She said she didn't want to ruin things for you. That you seemed happy. I clenched my jaw, forcing down the guilt. I had been so focused on making this situation work, on pretending that my parents had changed, that I hadn't seen what was happening right in front of me. But this was unforgivable. Rachel wasn't done. She told me something else. When Sophie finally stood up for herself, told Lisa she had a test to study for, and couldn't clean up their mess, Lisa lost it. She screamed at her to learn her place, and then, Rachel hesitated, and I knew whatever she was about to say would break me. She grabbed Sophie's arm and physically shoved her toward the front door, told her to get out. I sucked in a sharp breath. My hands curled into fists as I forced myself to stay calm. And my parents? Rachel's expression darkened. They watched. They did nothing. I didn't sleep that night. While Sophie lay safe on Rachel's couch, I sat at the kitchen table making phone calls. First, to my real estate agent, asking how quickly I could break the lease with my tenants. Then, to a moving company, setting a time for them to come as soon as possible. And finally, to my lawyer. By sunrise, I had a plan. The next morning, I took Sophie to breakfast at her favorite diner, though neither of us really ate. She just picked at her pancakes while I stirred my coffee, too angry to drink it. Baby, I said finally, setting my mug down. I need you to be honest with me. Has Lisa ever hurt you before? She hesitated, pushing a piece of pancake around her plate with her fork. She said I was spoiled. She finally whispered. That I thought I was better than her kids. My hands trembled as I reached for hers. And Grandma? Grandpa? Sophie bit her lip, then sighed. Grandma said the same thing. That I needed to learn my place. I inhaled sharply, gripping her hand tightly. Listen to me. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important to me than you. Not my parents. Not their house. Nothing. I squeezed her hand. We're going home to our apartment, and this time, we're staying there. Sophie's shoulders relaxed, the relief in her eyes making my anger burn hotter. After breakfast, I drove straight to my parents' house, barely waiting for my mother to open the door before pushing past her. Clara. She looked startled, eyes darting between me and Sophie. You're back early. I ignored her and walked straight into the living room, where my father sat in his recliner, reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. Get up, I said coldly. My father lowered the paper, brows furrowing. Clara, what's? I want you both to look at Sophie, I interrupted. My voice was calm, but I could feel the tremble of rage beneath it. Look at her and tell me you're proud of what you did. Tell me you feel good about letting Lisa throw her onto the street. My mother's face crumpled. We didn't have a choice, she whispered. Yes, you did, I shot back. And you made it. I turned toward the door, where the moving truck was already pulling up. My mother's confusion shifted into panic as she looked outside. Clara, what is this? I gestured for the movers to come in. Take everything I bought, I instructed. The refrigerator, the dishwasher, the washing machine, the new couch, the TV, all of it. You can't do this. My mother's voice rose in hysteria. I pulled out a folder from my bag, flipping to the receipts. Actually, I can, I said flatly. I bought them. They're mine. My father finally stood, his voice gruff. Let's talk about this rationally. Like you talked about throwing my daughter out. I snapped. Like you talked about stealing my college fund. They had nothing to say to that. As the movers worked, my mother pleaded. Clara, we need those things. The bills. You'll have to figure it out, I said coldly. The way I had to figure out college. The way Sophie had to figure out how to survive being kicked out in the middle of the night. I turned toward the front door, Sophie's hand firmly in mine. Consider this my final payment for all the times you chose Vanessa over me. I didn't look back. The next few months were interesting. My parents didn't go down without a fight. The calls started immediately, first from my mother, then my father, then Vanessa. At first, they were angry, full of accusations about how I was selfish, how I was abandoning my family. Then the guilt tripping started. Texts with screenshots of unpaid bills. Photos of Vanessa's kids looking sad. My mother even sent a picture of my old bedroom, as if that would somehow convince me to come back. I ignored them all. One evening, As Sophie and I sat on our apartment's balcony, sharing a pizza and watching the sunset, my phone buzzed with another call. I silenced it, tossing it onto the table. "Why don't you answer them?" Sophie asked quietly. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her shoulders more relaxed than I'd seen in years, her face free of the worry that had lingered since we moved in with my parents. "Because we don't owe them anything," I said simply. Sometimes, the best response is no response at all. Sophie nodded slowly, then hesitated. "I miss Grandpa's chess games sometimes," she admitted. "But not how they made me feel when Aunt Lisa was around." I pulled her into a hug. "You can still play," I told her. "We can find you a chess teacher. Someone who won't stop playing with you just because your cousin walks into the room." Sophie smiled then, resting her head against my shoulder. Weeks turned into months. Through the family grapevine, I heard updates. My parents had gone back to working full-time, struggling to keep up with their bills. The bank had begun foreclosure proceedings on the house. Vanessa still wasn't working, still complaining about me to anyone who would listen. I used the money I had been spending on their bills to take Sophie on weekend trips instead. We visited amusement parks, took cooking classes together, hiked trails just outside the city. Without my parents' constant drama, I focused more on my job, on my daughter, on finally giving us the life we deserved. And for the first time in a long time, I was happy. A year passed, and the weight of my parents and Vanessa slowly faded into the background. Without them, life felt lighter, simpler, free. Sophie thrived in ways I hadn't even realized she was holding back before. She joined the school chess club and made new friends, no longer overshadowed by cousins who demanded all the attention. Her grades improved, her confidence grew, and that anxious look she used to carry whenever we were home vanished. I didn't fully grasp how much living in that house had stifled her until I saw who she was becoming without it. For the first time, I had no one draining me. No calls demanding money, no guilt trips, no walking on eggshells to keep the peace. My career flourished, and with the extra money I used to throw into that bottomless pit of family obligation, I started actually living. Weekend trips, movie nights, cooking classes, things I never had time for when I was too busy trying to make everyone else happy. The peace was almost unsettling at first, like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it never did. I heard through the family grapevine that my parents lost the house after all. The bank foreclosed, and they ended up in a small apartment on the other side of town. The same house they had fought so hard to keep, the one they had begged me to save, was gone anyway. And Vanessa? She didn't stay with them. She had moved on, found a new man to take care of her and the kids, latching onto him like she always did. My mother still defended her, of course. "Vanessa just needs time," she reportedly told a relative. "She's doing her best." It was almost funny how predictable it all was. One Sunday morning, I was making pancakes when Sophie wandered into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair a tangled mess from sleep. She sat at the counter, watching me for a long moment before asking, "Mom, are you happy now?" The question caught me off guard. I set the spatula down, turning to face her fully. "Yeah," I said after a moment of thought. "I am." Sophie smiled, and for the first time in years, there wasn't a trace of hesitation in her expression. "Me too," she said simply. "I like it being just us." That afternoon, while Sophie was out with her friends, I sat on the couch and scrolled through my phone, my thumb hovering over my parents' contact names. A part of me wondered if they had truly realized what they had done, if they regretted it, if they even thought about me at all. But I knew the answer before I even finished the thought. They had made their choices, and I had finally made mine. I deleted their numbers without a second thought. Sophie and I weren't missing anything. We were enough.